We've previously talked about Dell and how they were already an established book publisher that decided to get into comic books. In early 1936, another book publisher entered the comic book business, again following the model of Eastern and their famous Funnies, the most successful comic book that had ever existed so far to this point. This company was David McKay Publications, and they were different from Dell in a couple of ways. David McKay was a much bigger, more established company with 40 more years of history under its belt, and it was a diverse company already publishing almost every type of book imaginable, from Shakespeare to travel guides to children's books. And they took an interest in comic books, perhaps because it was the only thing left that they weren't already publishing. Something else is different about David McKay is that this publisher had deep pockets and their own printers. Dell has never had that. Even now, when Dell is publishing popular comics, they're using a company called Western as their printer, an arrangement they will keep for decades with them. So David McKay is looking around in the small comic book field and says, National Allied isn't doing so hot with original material. Eastern is doing really well, but Dell is copying them, and they've licensed some of the hottest comic strips around. But they don't have all of them. They don't have Popeye. We already know that by 1937, Popeye is the second most popular comic strip character in the country, behind Little Orphan Annie. Why didn't Dell get Popeye? For that, we have to briefly talk about syndicates. We might associate syndicates with organized crime today, but that's not the context we're talking about here. A syndicate is a group of corporations that are pooling their resources to invest it in protecting their own interests. In this case, the corporations are the newspaper publishers and the resources are the popular comic strip characters. How they protect their own interests is in not breaking up that pool of resources. So the specific syndicate in this instance is King Features. They know they have a valuable property in Popeye, but you can't just get Popeye from them. You have to license a whole bunch more characters too. So that's what David McKay does. In addition to getting Popeye, they take Buck Rogers clone Brick Bradford, Little Orphan Annie clone Little Annie Rooney, Radio Patrol, the strip that Siegel and Schuster is calling all cars is a clone of. Notice a lot of cloning going on in comics? When I use the term clone I'm in this channel, in this context, I'm of course not talking about literal science fiction clones. I'm talking about plagiarized character concepts. Two of the characters that came with Popeye are too significant to gloss over. They are Flash Gordon and Mandrake the Magician. Flash Gordon I've mentioned before. It debuted 5 years after the debut of Buck Rogers, meant to be an imitation of it, and in most every way was, but it was elevated by the superb artwork of Alex Raymond. Alex Raymond's realistic art made Flash Gordon seem more serious than Buck Rogers. Flash Gordon had popularity equal to, if not greater than Buck Rogers' popularity by the time he was reprinted here in King Comics. The strip was published in 130 newspapers, translated into 8 foreign languages, and was read by 50 million people around the world. Although it was Alex Raymond's art that made Flash Gordon a success, when it was time to create a Sunday page for the strip, King Features gave it to a lesser talent, Austin Briggs. Briggs took over the entire strip when Alex was drafted into the Army, and after the war, King refused to give the strip back to Raymond, despite the fact that Raymond's art towards the end of his run has been described as fine art in the style of the Baroque period. Flash Gordon had an impact on the superhero genre, which we'll surely discuss here in time. Flash Gordon had 3 successful movie serials that were condensed and re-released as standalone movies. But if you grew up when I grew up, you remember Flash Gordon for this. Comic strip creator Lee Falk is best remembered for his character the Phantom, who some argue is the first superhero, and a character who ironically won't come to comic books for a long time. But his second most famous character, Mandrake the Magician, debuted in comic book form here and will have a greater influence on comic books than it ever had in comic strips. If you accept that magic is a superpower, some people say that Mandrake was the first superhero, which then makes him even more important to comic book history. But I think the least controversial statement you can make about Mandrake's impact is the number of clone versions of him that you see in comic books. The concept of a stage magician who can work real magic is, with very little deviation, the basis for characters like Zatara, Zanzibar, Dakor, Mantor, Kardak the Mystic, another guy called the Mystic, Sargon the Sorcerer, Zardi the Eternal Man, Blackstone the Master Magician, and Zatara's more famous daughter, Zatanna. Like the Phantom, Mandrake has always been more popular in Europe than here in the States, but Mandrake did still get a movie serial in 1939 and a radio series that lasted just over a year starting in 1940. I can't show you any pages from these issues of King Comics. In fact, for most features, I can't even tell you exactly what the contents are in these issues or how old the pages being reprinted are. That's because the King Feature Syndicate is still around now, 88 years later, and fiercely guards their trademarks and copyrights. They still peddle their characters to comic book companies to this day, the latest one being Mad Cave Studios. Though they have only published a Flash Gordon comic book so far, it appears that maybe you don't need a whole bunch more characters with the license anymore. There are a few other comic strip characters, classic ones, that need to be mentioned here, if not discussed at length. One is Bringing Up Father, the comic strip that began in 1913 and was a domestic comedy about poor Irish immigrants who have to cope with the social expectations on them as they become suddenly rich. The art on Bringing Up Father was a huge influence on Little Orphan Annie, particularly the pupilless eyes. Another strip is Snuffy Smith, the hillbilly spin-off of an older comic strip, Barney Google. Snuffy Smith was only introduced in Barney Google's strip as recently as 1934, but by 1936 is already a very popular comic strip character in his own right. Snuffy Smith was still in the Chicago Tribune when I was growing up and is today the second longest running syndicated comic strip that is still not all reprints. Oh, and then there's also Thimble Theater, starring Popeye the Sailor. Have I mentioned that character yet? Well, I've run out of time for today, but I'm going to be following up this episode with a special spotlight episode just on Popeye. That's right, it's the spotlight episode you didn't know that you needed. So make sure you come back for it. Before you go, make sure that you like and subscribe. But bye for now.